I'm Nate Hunt. I'm a research director at BW Research Partnership. We do research projects just like the one that I'm about to talk about right now, which is, really exploring the energy economy and workforce and figuring out pain points, opportunities, and kind of policy options. So today I'll be talking a bit about our work for BACMID, Bay Area Air Quality Management District, and the work that we did with them to survey contractors in the area working on appliance replacement and addressing kind of zero NOx requirements. Next slide, please. So basically what I'm going to talk through is quickly just cover the research methods that we used for this project. Then we'll go straight into kind of the key findings and recommendations. I think we'll do questions after the two panelists after me speak, but please, feel free to write those down as I go along through the presentation. Next slide. Okay, so our objectives for this project were really to understand, who are the workers that are going to be doing the appliance replacements and upgrades that are necessary to kind of meet the zero NOx requirements. Basically, we wanted to figure out what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, what are some of the concerns for contractors who do the installation, the maintenance, and repair of these technologies. And so in order to find some of that out, we conducted a survey of these contractors and interviewed a number of employers, training providers, and a few other stakeholders. Finally, we wanted to explore the different training programs that are in the Bay Area and that are relevant to the staffing for folks who can do this type of work, and any challenges or kind of bottlenecks potentially to support that workforce pipeline. Next slide. Great. So I talked a little bit about the survey. Basically, we got just under 100 respondents. That chart that you see to the right is basically maps census data in the gray bar on the number of contractors for each county. And the green bar is the number of respondents proportionally for each of those counties. Basically, all this says is that we got a relative geographic distribution of what the contractor mix is for the region. And so we just wanted to make sure that we were kind of hearing from contractors from all different counties throughout the Bay Area. In addition to the survey, as I mentioned, I think we did about 10 interviews with pre-apprenticeship programs, community colleges, vocational technical schools, and some employers as well, just to get a little bit more detail, nuance, and kind of understand some of the why behind the survey data that we got. Next slide, please. Okay, so to start out, this is just some data from extrapolated from Census Bureau. Has total number of workers that fall under these three occupations. We focus on electricians, plumbers and pipe, and HVAC installers. Basically, these are kind of the primary roles that we see as responsible for installation and maintenance of the kind of appliances that we're talking about. But there are certainly other kind of workers that are involved in this process depending on the project. But these are the three that we kind of had to limit our scope to for the project. Total employment, there's about 20,000 electricians in the Bay Area, a little over 10,000 plumbers and pipe fitters, and just under 10,000 HVAC installers. The real important number here is location quotient. And basically what that says is if the number is greater than 1, then there is a greater concentration of these occupations within the Bay Area than the national average. But what you'll see is these numbers are actually lower than 1. And what that means is that particularly for plumbers and pipe fitters and for HVAC installers, there's actually proportionally fewer of those workers with those skills who work in the Bay Area than there are relative to kind of the national economy overall. So already when we're talking about workforce for the region, for, relevant to the appliances that we're discussing, Bay Area is actually a little bit less concentrated for these types of workers. So one kind of initial data point there. Next slide. At the start of the webinar, there was discussion about wages and kind of the importance of making sure that these are jobs that, folks actually want to get into. And what we see is pretty strong wage opportunities across these three occupations compared to the kind of the same statistics for occupations throughout the economy. Electricians, plumbers, pipe fitters, and HVAC installers all generally earn more than the overall economy kind of comparable wage. So in the 25th percentile, which is kind of the lowest 25% of earners, electricians, plumbers and pipe fitters, and HVAC installers all earn a pretty decent premium over the kind of economy-wide 25th percentile of workers. Same thing holds true for the median. So exactly kind of in the middle of workers. And then as we get to kind of the highest earning workers in both the economy and among these specific occupations, the wages kind of compress a little bit. And so there's still a little bit of a premium for two of these roles, but HVAC workers at the higher end earn slightly less. But wages in the Bay Area are certainly an important consideration here. So it's good to know that the occupations that we're talking about are really, really competitive for what folks could be doing throughout the economy. Next slide, please. So one kind of important piece of context setting is when we're talking about the installation, maintenance, and repair sector for these technologies, the commercial and residential sectors look really different from one another. In that the commercial sector, obviously works on larger projects. They tend to be larger contractors. They tend to offer higher wages. They're more likely to be unionized. And because they are larger companies that need, a larger pipeline of talent, they tend to have more connections with training providers. On the residential side, we're often talking about, a contractor who has 1, 2, or 3 employees underneath them. Sometimes it's a little bit less formal. There can be more turnover among staff as folks kind of come into their roles and then leave. And there's often this really kind of constantly trying to kind of get new talent, get them up to skill, and then having that talent, once they are skilled, try and go start their own business. So the two dynamics, and it's not, perfectly black and white. There's definitely, some shades of gray here, but keeping that perspective in mind is useful when we're talking about these findings. Next slide, please. We asked contractors if they plan on growing over the next 3 years. Roughly half said that they do plan on growing, hiring more employees, but about half to a third for plumbers said that they actually didn't plan on growing. And speaking kind of to the slide that I was just talking about, a lot of this growth expectation was oriented around employer size or contractor size. So employers were more likely to say that they plan on growing in the coming years. Smaller employers were more likely to say that they kind of plan on keeping the same number of employees. And when we asked some folks about this in interviews, the common sentiment was, we have a full book of business. We're booked out for a few months. We're really happy with this. Don't rock the boat. Why, if the system isn't broke, don't fix it. Why would I want to take on the additional challenges of hiring more workers, potentially getting another truck, another HR person, et cetera? So really kind of, again, we see that dichotomy play out here for future growth. Next slide, please. Hiring difficulties, pretty much across the board. About 8 in 10 employers said that they had at least some hiring difficulty. While that is a high number, it's worth noting that that's actually not as high as the national figures. So employers are having some challenges. but actually the share of employers who are having a lot of challenges or great difficulty, that darkest shaded bar there, is, you know, relatively small, at least relative to some national perspectives. So that's good. Next slide, please. As noted before, across the board, there isn't a lot of connection with training providers. I think in part, again, driven by this dynamic of large employers versus small employers. Larger employers more likely to have connections with training providers, and smaller employers less likely. But really, it's important that 3/4 of respondents overall really basically said that they don't talk to apprenticeship programs, community colleges, etc., for their talent. Next slide, please. Another question that we asked was around where training would occur. So we first asked, you know, if folks were looking for additional training, where would you want that training to occur? And then we asked people if they plan on doing additional training at all. And the response to both of those questions was really, when it comes to location, that the distribution centers are really kind of the focal point for where these contractors hope to get training. Basically, how the system works is the carriers, the Mitsubishis, the OEMs, the equipment manufacturers of the world, sell their products through, you know, specific distributors, and then those distributors take those products and the trainings that the manufacturers give them and provide, you know, short training around those specific devices. And so that's kind of how contractors and their employees learn about these new systems, new technologies, through the manufacturers. And so through those distributors, it's kind of easier to bolt on some of these additional trainings that are maybe relevant to new technologies or zero NOx requirements or things like that. Next slide, please. When we looked at training providers, kind of scattered throughout the Bay, which is great. There is some disparity between the types of occupations that these training centers train for. So in the North counties particularly, there's not as many plumbing related training programs. So there are some gaps, but generally we see some pretty good coverage. Next slide, please. Awareness of the zero NOx rules themselves was relatively high, about 2 out of 3. But that still means 1/3 of folks are not really aware of regulations. We did this survey at the start of 2024, so hopefully when we kind of run the second iteration of the survey at the start of next year, hopefully these numbers are even higher. Next slide, please. Awareness of incentives, similarly, is pretty high across the board, but there's also some challenges around those incentives, or awareness of those incentives. One interview with a contractor, he said something like, you know, we're always trying to get the best deal for our customers, but I've also had so many customers come up to me and they know incentives that I don't. And so having some sort of centralized incentive database, but then also awareness of that database is really kind of an important component here. Next slide. Finally, getting to recommendations, and again, there's kind of a public report, I believe. We're happy to share that to dive more into this. But basically, we outlined some specific recommendations here that are oriented around, you know, the need for additional training around specific technologies like right sizing electrical appliances, and specifically heat pump water heaters. But also just on the general training side, there's need for more pre-apprenticeship programs, need for additional funding for instructors, and then also kind of preparation and support around the apprenticeship programs that do exist. Next slide. And then wrapping up here, you know, increasing access to some of these training opportunities, both in kind of the northern counties, but then also specifically within low income and disadvantaged communities. There's a EPA 608 certification, which is around refrigerant handling, that has, you know, potentially a few choke points in its accessibility. And finally, you know, incentive programs are super important. And there's a lot of money, and it's a shame if it's not being fully utilized. So making sure that contractors are aware of every single dollar that's available is really important. So with that, I think that wraps up my presentation. Apologies for rushing through at the end, but I want to make sure that we're sticking to schedule. So thanks so much.